Great. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the regular meeting of the Milwaukie Planning Commission. Agendas and additional copies of staff reports are available on the city website at www.milwaukieoregon.gov. You can locate them by navigating to the community calendar where tonight's meeting agenda and materials are posted. If you haven't reviewed the agenda, please do so. It contains important information about our process. The first order of business is our native lands acknowledgement. The city of Milwaukie respectfully acknowledges that our community is located on the ancestral homeland of the Clackamas people. In 1855, the surviving members of the Clackamas signed the Willamette Valley Treaty, also known as the Kalapuya Treaty, with the federal government in good faith. We offer our respect and our gratitude to the indigenous people of this land. Next order of business is the approval of the February 27th, 2024 and the March 12th, 2024 meeting minutes. Does anyone have any corrections to make first? Hearing none, I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Motion to approve. Second.
It's been moved to seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Are there 3.0 any informational items from staff?
I think the only thing that I will share, just so everybody's aware, if you haven't already heard, we just had a new police chief be sworn in, Ryan Burdick upstairs, and so Chief Straight just retired after being at the city for 29 years, so he's off to a new life in Arizona. Very exciting for him. And then we also just saw our city manager and move on to Washington County. And so we have Emma Sagor, who's going to be our interim city manager while they look for somebody else to take that position. And so there's just been a lot of change at the city and we're looking for good people. So if you know anybody wants to come here and be a city manager, reach out to them and say, hey, come join the city of Milwaukee. That's it.
Sounds good. Change is constant. We can move on to audience participation, an opportunity to comment on items not on tonight's agenda. It doesn't appear that we have any members of the public in our online attendance. I also know we don't have anyone in the room. If anyone shows up, we can come back to that. Otherwise, why don't we convene officially as the Community Involvement Advisory Committee? Does staff have any updates to report on, or do CIAC members have any items to report on?
I just wanted to let you all know that I did hear from Commissioner Carpenter last week or a couple weeks ago that wanted to get a little bit more information on what the role of the CIAC is. And I will bring that to you all so we can have a little bit more robust conversation about that. I've got that on the schedule for May 14th. So not our next meeting, but the following meeting.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I guess maybe, I'm not sure how you're looking at that, but another thing, it could also be not to create more work, but maybe a quick conversation with some of your partner jurisdictions about how do their CICs function and what are they doing and those kinds of things. That could be helpful to kind of color the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I did a little bit of that research before we kind of got into this whole thing, so I can do a little bit of checking around as well. Good idea.
Cool.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Commissioner Edge, Commissioner Wayne Mayor, anything from either of you on the CIAC? No?
No.
Wonderful. We can move on to our hearing items of the evening. Our first agenda item is a type 5 application for a package of proposed code amendments involving a comprehensive review and overhaul of Title 17 land division. The type 5 application for Title 17 code amendments is called the order. The purpose of this hearing is for the Commission's consideration of application number ZA-2023-006. We don't have anyone attending, but if we did, those folks could conduct themselves reasonably. And if they didn't, we would have to take other actions. I would then skip forward for a few things and ask staff to cite the zoning ordinance or sections where the criteria can be found.
Milwaukee Municipal Code, section 19.902, amendments to maps and ordinances, and section 19.1008, type 5 review.
Great. Does any member of the planning commission wish to abstain from this hearing? No. Does any member of the commission wish to declare an actual or potential conflict of interest? Nope. No. Great, let's proceed to the staff report.
Okay. Share screen for the presentation. Hopefully everyone is seeing a presentation. Okay. Vera Cole, senior planner, here to present this. The presentation may look familiar to the work session presentation, but we'll go through it in case folks end up watching this later. So the project goals for this project is, again, it's a proposed set of amendments. It's a complete review and overhaul of Title 17, which is our land division code. The city has made small amendments to Title 17 over the years, but we've not done a comprehensive review in many years. So we want to make sure that we took a comprehensive look at the whole thing, not just kind of fitting in little sections of amendments as we go. The amendments affect nearly every section of the title, and the objectives and the goals for the project is to ensure that the code accurately reflects current state law, particularly the Middle Housing Land Division code that was recently adopted. We want to make sure that we have clear and objective standards. We want to remove redundant and confusing language, clarify and simplify review processes, both to the benefit of the applicant and to staff, and address any recent legislation, again, involving middle housing. Okay, so the process, we did have one work session with the planning commission. We had a work session with city council. The code commentary and the proposed code amendments was posted with the 30-day notice. And so tonight we have a public hearing with you folks, with the commission, and then we have a public hearing with the city council that's been scheduled for next Tuesday. So while these are substantive code amendments in that we're rewriting a lot of section of code, they are not changes to policy related to land division. And so we have them sectioned off in sort of in a bunch of different kind of categories of amendments. The first is formatting and redundant language. So we wanted to go through the code. One of the things that we did was we eliminated tables of contents that just added a lot of pages and text to the code. We reorganized the sections to provide a separate section for Middle Housing Land Division. The code was sort of before was organized by, here's all the preliminary plat stuff and here's all the final plat stuff, but because Middle Housing Land Divisions are treated so differently under state law, we wanted it to be easier for staff to kind of jump to that section, but also for applicants to be able to just go to the Middle Housing Land Division section and just read all of it right there, rather than kind of jumping back and forth between multiple sections of the code. We also wanted to reduce, to the extent that we could, the number of lists that were in the code and rely on checklists that we could update as we go. So there are still some lists of items that are needed to be included on plats and so on, but those are mostly things that are required either by state law or things that the county surveyor requires. But to the extent that we could rely on checklists, we wanted to make sure that we did that. We also wanted to take a look at our review process and application requirements. So we rewrote the section for each land division type. So lot line adjustments, lot consolidations, plats, partitions, etc. Subdivisions, for example, within the current code, we are required to go through a type 3 review. And what we want to make sure, as we are trying to make sure in our Title 19 zoning code as well, is that we have clear and objective standards. So having subdivisions, just because you're dividing land into 4 or more lots, doesn't mean we don't think that you should automatically come in for a type 3 land use application process. Again, we have clear and objective standards. It's just math, the number of lots, compliance with Title 19, the engineering standards. To have folks go through a full type 3 review process for something that meets all of the standards seems needless. We're really trying to streamline processes both for staff and also certainly for the applicants as well. we wanted to revise the language to identify clear filing deadlines and extensions for land divisions. Those tend to, in our land division code, have been reliant on, for example, when the preliminary plat is approved, 6 months, you need to do this. And then when this happens, you have to do that, and it kind of was ending up in this string of deadlines that was really difficult to kind of coordinate and come back to make sure when something was still in play or if they needed an extension. So what we decided to do was tie it all to Title 19 so that there's consistency in extensions and deadlines between the two codes, and they all kind of live in one section of the code, so that we're not trying to toggle back and forth between Title 17 and Title 19. And we also wanted our extensions and the deadlines to be a bit more mindful of potential delays that can happen at the county level, for example. So if our deadlines are hard and fast, we're not able to accommodate what might be happening at the county surveyor's office for review. So we wanted to make sure that our stuff, was meeting our deadlines. We're not going to issue building permits until certain things happen anyway. So if things do end up getting delayed at the county surveyor because they're, piled up with a lot of things to review, we don't want that to create an issue on our end with the applicant. Those are things that just aren't unforeseen. Okay. We did add we included some new language within the code. The first part was adding language related to tracts and easements. These are things that come up during land division applications, but we didn't have good language that either defined them or talked about who's responsible for them. What is a tract or an easement? What can be in a tract or an easement? So they are defined in the existing code, but ownership and maintenance aren't specified. We know what they are, but we don't know what to do with them within the code. So the new language is provides staff and applicants with clear language for how they're to be handled in the future, hopefully minimizing conflict when the development is complete and owners or tenants change. And I know that there was some discussion during the work session about not wanting to try to force HOAs, on folks. So what we did was we included HOA or similar entity within the language so that the management responsibility for commonly owned areas or easements or anything like that, that can be kind of left to the development, the developer, and the residents. We're not forcing folks into an HOA situation. There may be other ways to kind of just make sure that there's someone kind of in charge or some entity that's kind of handling those kinds of responsibilities. We also added language to remainder or leftover parcels as part of a partition. And what we wanted to do was anticipate and provide for a process where a land division for maybe a oversized or a large lot would give folks that wanted to partition off the existing house, for example, on a lot like that and leave the rest for a developer, that someone could do that. They wouldn't need to come up with a full concept design and all kinds of things and kind of go through a full partition. If all they really wanted to do is just pull off their property and let somebody else deal with the rest of it. And what we wanted to do is make sure that we were eliminating any confusion about minimum density as part of the partition. Because if you have an oversized lot and you just kind of, there's an image here. So this is an example of a property that is almost an acre in size. And so we could, and this is just an example of a property. This hasn't actually happened. But if the owner of the home wanted to, just divide up, I just want my house, I don't want the whole property, and I'll let the rest of it kind of go on the market, or I'm just going to hang on to it and leave it to someone else to develop. In our case, under the current code, we would need to see minimum density, being accommodated here. But because of middle housing, there may be a way to kind of get to that minimum density without actually building it. And so we want to make sure that minimum density is in fact met during the development process, while still recognizing that somebody might want to just kind of house for later. So what we've done is we've created what we're calling kind of this leftover parcel section or section of the code that talks about, yes, this can happen, what would need to be done. We're not going to issue any building permits on that remainder parcel until minimum density is met through either a land use application or building permits or something like that. So we won't end up with kind of the sort of, large oversized lots with this. So we want to make sure that minimum density is maintained while still balancing the needs of someone, for So size lot. So that's new language. I don't think it's not a policy shift. It's a way for us to make sure that we are able to meet the density as part of these land division applications. I think that was the end of, yeah. So that was sort of the big piece of new language that we wanted to anticipate because folks have been coming in every once in a while with these kinds of requests for large lot divisions like that. So that kind of concludes sort of the content or the overview of the language. Staff, of course, does recommend and recommend members to the city council a recommendation for approval, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
I was gonna say, are there any kind of clarifying questions for staff? Yeah, Commissioner Edge.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Vera. Regarding the partition section in the draft code under so 17.12.40 under C3, it says full compliance with all requirements for subdivision, not partition but subdivision, may be required if the planning manager should determine that the entire parcel being partitioned is in the process of being divided for the purpose of subdivision. How is this clear and objective?
That's a great question. That is language that was left over from our existing code. And you're right, a subdivision isn't any different from a partition. So that's a really good catch. Thank you. Because yes, this is leftover language from our existing code, and I'm going to go back and check out. Thank you for catching that. You're right, because the process would be the same. It's still a type 2, it's just the number of lots. So I will go back and double check that and make sure that that's.
So, okay, so even it wouldn't functionally change anything anyway.
Correct.
But we do want the code cleaned up. Okay, well that's.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. Yeah, that's when subdivision had a different review process. So yeah.
And then the other follow-up question was, in terms of our natural resources code and the interplay here, that really comes down to just the only changes that we're really seeing here are the kind of the allowing an HOA or similar entity under non-fractional ownership, I believe, to be the party that owns the tracts that are not to be developed. Is that correct?
Yes, for tracts or easement, yes, correct. So, but what we want to make sure is that it's not in conflict with the natural resources code and that land division process, which I know that Breck is working on. And so we will make sure that they're not in conflict, but you're right. What we wanted to make sure was that the language for tracts and easements had language in there about who was in maintaining them, but it could be some other entity, like something that might come up through a natural resources land division. Yes. If that answers your question.
Yeah, mostly. I mean, I think it might be more of a question for Brett later in the work session than it is here. But I think it's really I'm curious about and we're not changing policy here is kind of what you led with, and so I'm trying to make sure I'm not looking at this as an opportunity to advance policy that's in the comp plan, even though, the code is being changed, but is also just kind of being moved over, and just reformatted, like you were saying. So, but yeah, I just wanted to, and maybe we'll just talk about this later in the work session with the natural resources code, but, yeah, I just wanted to kind of understand that was all we were doing was just kind of clarifying that for the natural resources area, and you said yes, so thank you.
And maybe just for my own kind of clarification, when you were saying, maintained by an HOA or similar entity, like a similar entity could be some sort of conservation organization or other things like that are going to take the stewardship responsibility.
Correct, and actually, in that section, it's 17.24, we talk about an HOA or similar entity, a public or private nonprofit organization, the city or other jurisdictions. So there's a list of potential entities that could take over ownership of a tract, for example. And so that public or private nonprofit organization, could fit the bill for something that might come up as part of the natural resources land division as well. So I think we have it covered, but we'll make sure that we do. But I think we've written out a list that's pretty wide. It's a wide net, that won't be in conflict with everyone that's up in Brett's code of ethics for the natural resources.
Great. Any other clarifying questions for staff? With a well-dressed city attorney joining us. Great, have we received any correspondence on this matter, other than those items included in the meeting packet?
We have not, no.
It does not appear that we have anyone wishing to testify on the application. Don't have any attendees here at Zoom, and no attendees other than members of the planning commission staff here in the room. So I will close the public testimony portion of the hearing. The public testimony portion of the hearing on the type 5 application for Title 17 code amendments, file number ZA-2023-006 is now closed. Is the commission ready for discussion? Does anyone want to lead off on this? Commissioner Edge?
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to lead off on this. These really technical ones are my favorite. But anyway, of course, this is really dry, you know, and I know it's not very exciting. Obviously, got a lot of attention from the public tonight. But it's important, and making sure that it's clear and objective, you know, so that we can comply with state law is really important. You know, we just need to make sure that our code is legal. So you know, and I think that the reorganization, everything that, you know, the way that we've it's been proposed by staff it looks good. I think it reads easy, and it will be helpful. And I know that historically, I think, you know, if you were to look back, you know, decades, planning commissions have, you know, traditionally been responsible for reviewing, you know, major subdivisions, and there's always been an amount of discretion, you know, obviously involved in that over history. But and you know, I know that we're changing that here, and it's for very practical reasons, completely okay, you know, because why why go through all of this expense and time and energy, you know, and us reviewing all of this material so that it can, you know, I mean, it's clear and objective. We know it's going to be, we know it needs to be approved. And so this looks really good. Thanks for bringing it to us, and thanks for, you know, the work session and, you know, the discussion about the, you know, the issues and the questions that we had. And I like what you brought forward, and I'm happy to recommend approval to City Council tonight.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Edge. Commissioner Wayne-Mayor, anything you want to add?
Not at this moment.
Great. Commissioners Carpenter, Mulhorn?
I would second Commissioner Edge's input. Agree that most people don't find this very exciting, but I love it. I'm happy to see the changes and the slimming down and making it clear and objectable. So you know, applaud staff's efforts on this for a long time. And so thank you again.
And I think likewise, I appreciate kind of the streamlining effort. I think, as was kind of talked about, moving subdivisions away from type 3 to type 2 makes a lot of sense. And I think the changes on the partition that we were talking about, I think, is a really interesting opportunity creating for folks, or stewardship opportunities or other things like that. Maybe just kind of point of clarification before we move on to a vote. Commissioner Edge, were your question on 171240 dot C sub 3, were you thinking we would be striking that as part of our recommendation to City Council? Vera's shaking her head yes. So
yeah, if we need to include the language in the motion, that's fine. You know, I think I think staff is going to make the correction and take that to city council, so it's okay. But yeah, if we want to make that the motion to amend that that provision, I'm happy to do that.
Sounds great. I was gonna say, do you want to make that motion for me?
Yeah, let's see. I move that we recommend approval of application ZA-2023-006, Title 17 code amendments, with the amendment to, help me out.
Strike 17.12.040.c3 as discussed by staff, or staff understands our intent.
Perfect. So moved.
So it's been moved,
Second.
been seconded. Commissioner Carpenter, anyone else care for any discussion on this, or are we ready to vote this on the city council? Looks like we are. All those in support, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thanks, staff, appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone.
Great. The decision is a recommendation to Milwaukee City Council, which will make the final decision after a public hearing. Please see planning staff for details concerning the city council hearing date and process. We'll move on to our work session item of the evening. This is our natural resources code amendments. A discussion of proposed natural resource code amendments specific to tree code coordination. Our good friend, senior planner Brett Kelver, is here to present the information for discussion.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm Brett Kelber, Senior Planner with the city's planning department, and I think this is the first meeting I've been in with you, Commissioner Fuenmayor, so nice to meet you virtually. Hopefully I'll get to meet you in person sometime. But good evening. So let me share my screen and get a presentation up here for you. So bear with me a moment.
This might be a little technical too.
Okay, so can everyone see my slide presentation, the first slide? Okay, so what? Well, I've got the wrong thing. I'm sharing the wrong thing. How did I do that? Hang on a second. Try this again. There we go. Okay.
Are we good? Do you see the natural resources code?
Perfect.
Okay, take two. We already talked about Title 17. We're gonna talk about natural resources. And this update project that we're just starting, this is the first of what we figured would be 3 work sessions with the commission to try to get us all on the same page and up to speed about the project and this particular part of the code. So the other 2 sessions that we're looking to do, this was gonna focus on coordination with the tree code, the residential tree code. And then the next sessions, I think we're gonna talk more about some code issues in general, maybe getting at, for example, the issue that Commissioner Edge is relating to is one example of kind of more coding things. And then another session, we figured we would talk a little bit about some of the mapping updates that we're wanting to make and how to handle some of those. But for tonight, we're gonna start with the tree code, but as a way of diving into this, I think I want to just make sure that we're all knowing what we're talking about with respect to the natural resources in general and how they're handled and referred to in our code. And so just kind of following up on the staff report and some of the attachments were there, I'll try to fly through this a little bit, but just want to encourage you too, if you have questions at this session or another session about the natural resource code in general, this is a good time to talk about and try to sort some things out. So there are 2 primary resource categories that are covered in the city's maps. One, the one that's been in effect since 2002, it covers water quality resource areas. They're shown here in this overview. You can see, it's a little bit hard to see the detail, but they, in general, our areas are focused on Johnson Creek and Kellogg Creek. We have some wetland areas kind of in the central part of the city, but those are the basic resources. And I guess what I want to say about the habitat conservation areas, or HCAs, both of these things come from two different goals in the statewide list of planning goals. The water quality resources, like I said, they were introduced in 2002. They're based on goal 6, which focuses on resource quality, so air quality, water quality, land quality. And the way our code has covered them has primarily been through requiring a discretionary review. There's not much you can do to disturb some of these key resources without getting into planning commission review. Just not a lot of exceptions and exemptions. And one difference, the habitat conservation area or HCA rules came into place in 2011, and they're based on goal 5, which focuses on natural resources, scenic and historic resources and open spaces, and largely use tree canopy as in addition to the water resources themselves as wildlife habitat. So where there's been overlap of the two layers, we've generally assumed or understood that the water quality resource or WQR areas were more protective because they more quickly give you a discretionary review. And so the HCAs did come in offering a clear and objective path. That was kind of the thing at the time, just a decade or so ago. And I think there was pressure to provide a clear and objective path in addition to the discretionary review. And so when you're dealing with only these HCA areas outside of the WQR, there is an opportunity for you, if you meet some clear and objective standards, to have a lighter review. An example would be in no case can you disturb more than 50% of the HCA on a site, or 5,000 square feet, whichever is less. And I think a site that was covered entirely by the HCA, like let's say a 5,000 square foot lot, it's already at the max 5,000 square feet, so we're going to take the smaller one, 50%. The most that can be disturbed would be half of the HCA on the site. So the idea is, the more resource you have on the site, the more the clear and objective standard works to your benefit, because the idea is it's trying to let you do something with the site. At the same time, it's trying to push you to use the non-resource areas on the site. So if you just had a little bit of HCA on your site, the encouragement would be find another place to do the work. So this image that I'm showing you just as a way of illustrating, I'll see if I can use the mouse here. So there are a couple different features. If you can see a little bit, the blue speckling that's underneath the layering here. So for example, this lot that has a house on it, a big chunk of this property is actually delineated wetland. And so this blue speckled layer is showing a wetland resource, which is a kind of a key water quality resource, in addition to a stream would be another one of these features. Then around the border or along the border of wherever the resource is, whether it's a wetland or a stream, usually within 50 feet, there's an extension of this vegetated corridor. This is also considered water quality resource area. And the way the code handles these things is you are WQR if you fit the definition. If you're a delineated wetland, if you're a certain caliber of stream, and the map just kind of indicates generally where the protections are. You can see the idea is, even though there's some development within this buffer area, it's still regulated by the code. So someone may say, well, my house is in the WQR or my yard is in the WQR. That you still have to go through the review process. So the idea that's supposed to be kind of a buffering area to protect water quality. Now, a difference, the HCA, let's see if I can move.
Yeah, I was gonna ask what's going on there.
So you can see this lot to the east. It's a little bit hard to tell with all the colors going on, but there's this one green line running through the middle. This is the extent of the WQR on the site, and so the orange area beyond it is the remaining HCA that's kind of singularly covering the site. And so the way that HCA was established was it was done with aerial imagery mapping, the idea was to focus again, as I mentioned before, on tree canopy, and so. It was a little gross because of the high level that it was, and so there was an understanding that there would be some inconsistencies, that the map would pick up some features that were already developed. And the way we understand the HCA is that the map, wherever the map tells you it is unless you show that it was developed. And so you can kind of see a little bit of a difference. I think this property here to the east, it's not really worth carving out the existing house here because that's also within the WQR. And so again, it is WQR resource, but beyond it, no, I think no one's really done a project on this site that tried any cleanup. If we were gonna clean this up, we might have someone make a case that maybe this little structure should come out. But when we got the map, we didn't have the capacity to go through and look at lot by lot and do the kind of cleanup that actually for some reason looks like we maybe did here. Where we did, maybe there's a question or some kind of project that happened on this property, and so we took the opportunity to more clearly define the HCA where it actually is. This is probably paved parking area, the house. So when we have opportunities, because of a project on a site, we have tried to clean up the HCA map.
And
But
just to be clear, the map came from Metro, from their process, from when they went through and kind of had a formula. And then went and did kind of this gross overview, and they did it regionally, right? And so the idea is that if you can say, well, the map isn't accurate, somebody can go in and make a case that it's not accurate. And as long as they can kind of prove that case, then you can make updates to the map.
right,
So developer or property owner hires a smart consultant firm to work with them on getting a map update and submitting that to the city as part of a development package, is that?
yeah, that could be, and we can get into this more when we get into the mapping work session that we're gonna do, but I think it's good to kind of keep it in mind. I think there are two ways that a map correction could happen with an HCA, for example. One is you come in to do your project and we can all see on the map that your house is included in the HCA. And so there's a fairly easy process to just kind of show that that's an understandable inconsistency. A different kind of review, which maybe gets more of what you're suggesting, Chair Thurman, is there is a vegetated area on my site that's showing up as HCA, and I'm not sure I really believe that it's providing a habitat value. And so I'm gonna engage someone with some expertise to go through the methodology that Metro gave us and kind of do the same kind of analysis to see like, is this really providing the tree canopy, is it close enough to watering, that kind of thing. So there are two kind of levels of review, and the code acknowledges those. So like I said, we'll come back in another work session and talk a little bit more about some of the things we're trying to correct or improve with the mapping, but that's, I guess, the starting place for this here. So shifting to our topic of the night, which is, oh, I will move
Sorry,
this,
yeah,
yes,
thank
thank you, yeah, let me move folks back. The tree code, the residential tree code, so as most of you are aware, within the last couple of years, the city has added a layer of protections for trees on residential property. So we have a tree code that applies to residential zones. It's primarily focused on helping the city meet its goal of getting 40% tree canopy by 2040, I think. So it's very focused on canopy, and it has identified kind of two streams, I guess. There are situations where there's development happening and situations where someone's not doing what's considered development, they're just trying to manage trees on their site. So I think some key things to think about or keep in mind as we're talking about how the tree code intersects with the natural resources code is to recognize that they have different purposes and they have different applicability. So there are places where the tree code applies because it's a residential zone, but we're not talking about natural resources because they're not close to a stream or wetland. And there are places where we're talking about a wetland or a stream, but it's not a residential zone, it's a commercial property or industrial property, so the residential tree code is not in place. So there are a couple of dimensions, a little bit where there's, I guess there's the Venn diagram, a little bit of some overlap and some not. So Another clarification to make about the tree code, it considers development situations to be defined by someone's creating a dwelling unit. And they're creating that unit in a way that by expanding building footprint. So if I'm adding an ADU in my basement or in my existing footprint of my house. And I'm for some reason trying to remove a tree, I'm not dealing with the development tree code, I'm dealing with the non-development tree code. The same would be the case if I'm doing a big addition to my house, adding a couple bedrooms. And taking out some trees, but no dwelling unit, I'm gonna be dealing with the non-development tree code. Some of the differences are that the development tree code, I think the city sees that as a legitimate opportunity to try to advance the tree canopy percentage so that. When you are adding a dwelling unit, increasing footprint, whether you're taking out trees or not, you're gonna be required to plant or pay the equivalent of planting to that 40% canopy. When someone is simply managing trees on their property, the tree code is handling it more like it's really trying to encourage preservation. And if there's a legitimate reason to remove the tree, as is outlined in the tree code, they're getting, either required replanting or getting some mitigation fees. So there are just a couple different streams there. And I think the way I'm looking at and understanding our natural resources code is the development type situations. Because the natural resources code doesn't really distinguish between development and non-development, it has a short list of exempt tree removal opportunities and then an administrative review, a little bit longer list of opportunities, but it's not really discriminating the same way about development or non-development. I think the understanding is that if you're doing a project that is involving more than tree removal and it's involving disturbance of those resources, you're probably into a bigger review, and that's where we'll be talking about tree replacement. So there may still be overlap with the tree code, the urban forester may still be reviewing some of the proposed tree removal, but there's also probably going to be a higher level of natural resource review. So I think the focus of what I've been looking at about the intersection of the two codes and what I was going to talk with you about tonight is mostly looking at those kind of more non-development situations, looking at the natural resources codes, list of exempt tree removals and administrative review removals, and comparing or trying to see how well that's fitting in with most of the non-development tree code with its type 1 tree permits, its type 2 tree permits.
Just residential,
Only in residential.
only residential.
Right.
It's complicated.
So, I think some of the things that, and some of this is covered in again, all those attachments where there's some comparison of the two codes, and also like one of the, I think attachment 3 includes a little bit of suggested language about some of the edits we're thinking about making to the natural resource code. I guess some of the things I was gonna highlight are kind of on this list. There were a couple things that were affected a little bit when we made some initial changes to the natural resource code when the residential tree code was coming into play. One of them was our definition of tree. I think we adjusted it to fit the tree code's definition, which doesn't include a minimum size. Our definition of tree used to say, we consider you a tree if you're 6 inches or greater diameter or breast height. That changed. We lost the 6-inch mark when we tried to integrate with the tree code. And I think we didn't maybe realize that was an issue because didn't really realize that the tree code is more specific in certain spots where it says, I'm only concerned if you're 6 inches or greater. And we hadn't quite put those kinds of markers back in the code. So I think one simple fix is just trying to make sure that we're being very clear and trying to be consistent with what we care about as a tree. So historically, the natural resource code wasn't as concerned if a tree was less than 6 inches. And so I think that's what the residential tree code is focused on now. So it seems like reasonable to go back to that.
Is residential tree code 6, or for some reason I'm also remembering, I mean, you've clearly worked on this more recently than me, but for some reason I thought there was a compromise where it landed at 12 inches DBH. Does that, again, you've probably looked at this more recently than I have.
I've looked at it enough to have moments of clarity and also still greater confusion about it. I'm trying to wade through my confusion, get clear. I think there is a 12-inch threshold.
Maybe it's a trigger for something else if it's
Yes.
larger than 12 inches. I can't remember the intricacies.
Yes, I think one example is if you have a healthy tree that is less than 12 inches diameter at breast height, you can go through a type 1 tree permit to remove it. Over 12 inches and you're gonna need a heavier review for them. So I think, yeah, there are a couple different markers.
That sounds familiar, thanks.
Another thing is, again, because the tree code is concerned primarily with canopy preservation, it's less concerned about the species that you are. It does take note of it. It acknowledges rare and threatened species and also invasive species, but it doesn't care as much about native species, which are very much a concern for the Natural Resource Code when we get into especially mitigation planting. We want people to be planting from a list of natives to try to restore the ecological system. But the tree code has a type 1 permit for removal of even a single invasive tree. And currently does not require replanting for that tree.
And to be clear, there's the type 1 tree code and the type 2 tree code, which are not the same as our type 1. But yeah, there's the tree permit, type 1 tree permit, type 2 tree permit. Then there's a type 1 land use code and a type 2 land use code. They're different.
Right.
Wait, yeah.
Right.
They're different things.
There are
So
some,
we just talked before this about passing on some streamlining recommendations to Milwaukee City Council with land division. Maybe we should think about some streamlining here as well, right? This type 1, that type 1, like, I mean, clearly staff are even confused about what it is, are we talking about apples or oranges or kumquats?
Right.
So I'll just kind of put that out there as maybe a broader, more global comment.
yes,
It's all a
because-
work in progress. It's like they've just been starting to implement this now. They're already going in and implementing changes to the tree code.
Yeah.
And then we're trying to catch it up with our stuff while they're moving. And so it's gonna be kind of, I think, a work in progress over the next couple of years. Yeah, but
But if it's this confusing, even for, some of the experts in the room, imagine how it is for a community member or a developer, is they're, ideally wanting to do the right thing, but not sure, which door to walk in and what piece of paperwork to fill out.
yeah, we're trying this.
I think I do feel like the Roman numerals, the type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, type 5 that we deal with in the land use review, I feel like they have a certain lighthouse kind of aspect to them, like they're in the code, they reach and touch a lot of different things. So maybe it is worth going back to the urban forestry folks and just making the gentle suggestion that they might consider changing their type 1, type 2 to type A, type B, something like
Change
that.
the nomenclature.
Because it's newer and it's interesting that there are some similarities. I mean, I think they're in a way their type 1 permit is set up to be clear and objective. I mean, it's supposed to be like, if I show you that I'm this kind of tree, you should probably let me remove it. And their type 2 ends up having a lot more discretion with an appeal opportunity. So there are some similarities, but it is still.
The words are confusing.
Yeah, and it may be that in our conversations about this, there are these opportunities for confusion, but perhaps beyond that, when people are just dealing with the permit, especially if we're able to eliminate some redundancies or review, maybe it isn't that much of an issue. If I'm getting a type 2 tree permit, whatever, I don't know about your other land use thing. So, but it's worth a suggestion for them.
It's 6 inches, just.
Great, thanks.
So. The invasive tree issue, the tree code, the natural resource code, allows an exemption of removal of up to 3 invasive trees of any size really during a calendar year. And that again reflects the different values where I think there's a recognition that it would be better to allow people to remove those invasive or noxious species from our areas to allow other plants to establish themselves. So we wanted to encourage that behavior. And we didn't want to bog it down with the review, but by not reviewing it, we also kind of decided to forego the opportunity to require replanting ourselves. So as long as the tree code itself isn't requiring replanting, it seems like maybe that's okay. Like, so if I'm getting a type 1 tree permit to remove an invasive tree that happens to be in a natural resource area, they're not gonna make me replant it. The natural resource code isn't gonna make me replant it, so it's consistent. There are some discussions happening, however, though, about requiring replacement of invasive trees through the tree code, and if that happens, I think our recommendation is, since you're already getting a type 1 permit and having to replant, we should make you replant the invasive tree in the natural resource area. You're gonna have to do it anyway. So we're keeping an eye on that discussion. One of our other exemptions in the natural resource code has been to, if there is a truly emergency type situation where a tree is like across the road or is leaning in a very precarious way towards a house, we didn't want to get caught up in liability issues with that. We wanted people to be able to remove them and so exempted that, which also again meant we weren't requiring replanting. Interestingly, the tree code acknowledges emergency situations, but still requires a type 1 permit. It just acknowledges that it will be handling those in a retroactive way, which also seems perfectly reasonable. And I think we've had a few situations where we recognize like, boy, it felt like a little uncomfortable to just let the person remove this tree saying it was an emergency. Didn't want to get pulled to a liability situation, but okay. Now knowing that at least in residential areas, they'll be getting a retroactive permit and they will have to replant. Again, we figure like, well, let's take that out of our exempt category, let's put it in the type 1 administrative natural resource review. We'll do it retroactively and we'll take the same, we'll work with or use the urban forester to kind of help us through that. This is a spot where you can acknowledge that what happens if it's not a residential situation, it's a commercial or industrial property, is it okay that we just set up a type 1, review, natural resource review for ourselves for that? And again, I think that it feels like, one, it's, since we're making folks do that in a residential area, why not apply it evenly to the other zoned areas as well? And I think also if the city's capacity increases in the future, to extend the tree preservation and tree protections to other zones besides just residential zones, then we'll be there already, I think. So I don't know what kinds of conversations are happening at the city level about that. I think they feel like they're at capacity right now just dealing with residential zones, but it does seem like it would, the more we can kind of handle it all the same way where we can, that's what we think would work best. There was a conversation that we had about natural resource management plans, which are a thing in the natural resource code. We haven't had a lot of them happen. We don't have very many applications for those ever. The idea was to acknowledge that there may be times, one's coming up, I think.
We do have one right now.
Johnson Creek Watershed Council is gonna do a project at the mouth of the creek where they're installing large woody debris in the water and doing some other, I imagine, plantings and that kind of thing. They're probably gonna show us a plan that has been signed off on by a state or federal agency. And so the natural resource code says if you've got something from ODFW or the Division of State Lands, we're not gonna say anything else about it. We're gonna say that these experts have looked at it. We'll just do a simple type 1 review for the natural resource code to capture that. There is a type 2 option for that if you're not working with one of those agencies. There's some standards that are laid out or some guidance laid out for what your plan should look like. It's a type 2 review. But again, the idea was if someone has gone through that process and gotten their natural resource plan adopted, my initial thinking going into this was, why shouldn't there be in a residential area an exemption in the tree code for this? Like someone's already reviewed it, the urban forester may have already reviewed it if it was type 2. Why are we making someone go through the process again? That conversation was interesting, and it kind of reflected again a reminder of the different goals of the 2 codes, because again, they're concerned with canopy and are having different discussions about what constitutes an invasive or a nuisance type of plant. And so there's a lot of reluctance, understandably, I think, I get it now, to just say, sure, go ahead. If someone said that it fits in with their enhancement plan, fine. An example which may be a little extreme was, it sounds like there's a very mature chestnut tree on Elk Rock Island. That's not a native species. So the concern was, if someone came in to restore Elk Rock with native vegetation, and their management plan said, oh, by the way, we're also taking out this tree because it's not a native. There'd be some heartburn about that from the urban forestry side. So they're wanting to just keep a foot in on that, and it feels like, okay, fine. Well, I think because we get so few of them, and because their review, I think the tree permit review won't be that onerous. We were hoping to cut out some duplication, but it doesn't feel like one to really hang a hat on in terms of battling about. So they've made their points about that, and even though I think we will even get the Johnson Creek example and kind of see how that works. I think we wanted to avoid a little bit of that awkwardness of you came through our process and got a natural resource review for your management plan. But you're also
Now
gonna have
over
to talk to
here.
your urban forester and maybe pay mitigation fees or replant where. Maybe their management plan is hopefully showing they're replanting anyway, so some of it may be,
I think there's some more room to talk about that, I do think there's some more room, because you would imagine that if they're putting together a natural resource management plan with us, with all of the other partners that are working on this, that all have the same goals, that there would be room for possibly planting trees, and so that somehow that could be counted towards, but anyway, that's entire internal dialogue that we need to be kind of working out, I think, with our natural resources.
I think
Figuring
that-
out the best way.
I mean, and I don't know how much more on the presentation, but I think that like thinking about it as well, less from a city staff, which, silo of our small city wants to be the lead on this, and thinking about it more from a property owner, an applicant kind of perspective, I feel like it could just help, because I think as you were suggesting, is like, does a natural resource plan supersede the tree code? Right, or like which one is primary and which one is secondary, and it seems like we should be clear on that, right? So that again, an applicant kind of knows what they're doing, it's their.
Agreed, and I think that's still kind of what we're still trying to work through that one. But the idea is, yes, that it should be easiest for the applicant, while also meeting the city goals, right? That
Sure,
we don't want to
yeah.
put anybody through like a duplicative process. Seems like.
Or have one part of the planning department say you're good to go and people start to move forward and then the forester steps in and says, no, you're not, it's just like, that's not a good look.
it's not.
Nope.
So I guess we could try to think about how to have more of that conversation. I would have more heartburn about it if we saw more of these applications,
So
be like,
clear of
this is gonna be awkward again and again, but it doesn't happen that often. In concept, it seems like it's got some awkwardness and silliness.
And we happen to be in that moment right now because we're doing it with the
Yeah.
restoration project, but anyway.
So, I think kind of building on that, what we do wanna do is try to remove some of the duplication where we can. So in some of these examples where we've got lists of tree removal that would get type 1 natural resource review, that will also be covered by a type 1 or type 2 tree permit. We've been thinking that it might make sense to just include a simple phrase or in the code, in the natural resource code, to say, hey, if you were in a residential zone and also going through tree review, that'll take the place of this. Because you're probably gonna be required to replant. It seems like most of those situations line up, especially if the invasive thing happens the way that it may. And I think that our interest in maybe keeping track of how many trees are removed from natural resource areas can be met kind of internally, I think, by coordinating with other staff, and it would be one way to eliminate a little double process. So I think that's the direction that we're thinking of trying to go. Again, acknowledging that it's a little uneven in some ways, because we will still be doing natural resource review for trees in commercial zones or industrial zones, but we won't have those same permit or file numbers for residential trees. But I think understanding that things are maybe moving in that direction, where maybe in the future, we're gonna have tree coverage, tree permit coverage for the whole city regardless of zone. Maybe it'll even out at some point. And then just a couple other small things I think that we've noticed. Yeah,
I don't know if this is a appropriate time to ask, but I know we were talking specifically about residential early on. When you talked about HCA WQR and the 50% or 5,000 square feet, that was specifically for residential, correct?
yes,
Is there a similar comparison for industrial or commercial?
for non-residential sites, there is an outright allowance to disturb up to 10% of the ACA on the site.
Is there a disconnect in terms of the lot coverage, in terms of what the code would allow for development. And then what it, so 10% versus, because that seems to me, and maybe we can bring this up later, again, it seems off topic right now, but that seems like it's a disproportionately higher impact to commercial or industrial parcels with natural resources on it compared to what the development code would allow for them to develop. Does that make sense?
Not
Or-
exactly, let me try to get clear, you're saying it's a bigger impact on those properties in terms of their development potential, or it's a bigger impact on the natural resources also?
On their development potential. Is that, I know that seems discongruous to why we have a natural resource code, but
Well,
we're competing with, wanting to bring jobs and again, if this comes up in session 2 or 3, great, but
yeah,
we can-
I think that I try to address it one, because I mean, just had a couple more things to cover, and this is all fair game anyway, I think, a starting point for me on this question is, and again, we're just talking about ACA.
Yeah.
Is what will I let you do without getting you into discretionary review? Cause I will still let you do stuff, it just may be you're coming to talk to the planning commission about it, that was one of the things about the ACA, was it was kind of. The model code that was given to us incorporated some of these built-in like clear and objective paths, and the path for non-residential properties was, I will let you disturb up to 10% of the HCA in a clear and objective way. Like no more questions asked, just do the mitigation, you're good to go. If you need to do more than that, need to disturb more of that resource, then we've got a discretionary process for you. So I think when you think about, for example, like I think like a manufacturing zone.
and that made more sense.
Okay,
So that helps.
Our manufacturing zone requires a minimum of 15% landscaping. I guess, now we're talking about a little different percentages, because you could have a lot of HCA on the site or not very much. If you didn't have very much, disturbing 10% of that is already like, you got 100 square feet, you can only disturb 10 square feet.
Yeah.
So there's a little apples and oranges there, but it sounds like that clarified.
That does in terms of the discretionary after that, yeah, so thank you. So,
The last two things I'll say are just that a couple small things that we noted were not quite matching with the tree code and natural resource codes. We have different size requirements for when you're replanting a tree. And it seems like it just makes sense for us to migrate over to the side. They're fairly close, but to just be consistent with the tree code. Interestingly, the tree code for, again, non-development situations, which is most what we're talking about here, doesn't require survival. Again, some of it I think is a capacity, it's just like, there's enough permits, enough review happening, like, let alone going back to check 2 or 3 years later. We've had that in the natural resource code from the beginning, while we haven't always had a great system for following up, at least that requirement is there. And so that's where I think it's, even in some cases where we may let the tree code permit take over some of our type 1 things, we're gonna keep the survival thing, and we, as a staff, as a department, will follow up on the survival part of it. The last thing I'll say is just that, again, one of those kind of unintentional things that happened when we tried integrating the tree codes, that when the tree code first came into play, was they brought in some specific names of lists, like they wanted to use the Oregon State noxious plant list. And that replaced our reference to the Milwaukie native plant list in several places. We have been using the Portland plant list, which includes natives and noxious and invasive plants, and we were using it for both telling people what to do when they're mitigating, because it includes natives, and also giving the guidance about what's okay to remove, what we don't care about so much because it's a nuisance or invasive. And so we lost that inadvertently, so we wanna get some kind of reference to a plant list back in that includes some natives. So with all that in mind, I think those are the points I wanted to cover, and I maybe, unless someone knows they have some questions that'd be helpful to keep any of the slides up for, maybe I'll stop the share and we can just talk a little bit or see what questions you have about tree code especially, but also the other questions about the WQR and the HCA and how the natural resource code works.
Yeah, and I know Commissioner Edge has his hand up, and maybe before that, I think one thing I'm just kind of thinking through, so let me just test this to make sure I'm understanding correctly, is that generally it sounds like with natural resources code amendments, we're talking about taking the natural resources code and aligning with tree code as our kind of most recent thinking on these topics. Is that kind of maybe broad brush strokes, what you're kind of proposing is let's take the tree requirements that we've had and kind of bring them in line with current thinking?
Yeah, kind of.
Yes.
I mean, on some things, like for example, on the size thing, yes, and acknowledging that they're doing that they are requiring permits on residential properties for most tree removal. We are moving towards that. In other respects, like we're gonna hang on to a survival requirement and we want a bigger list of invasives. They have 4 invasive trees on their list right now. It's hawthorn, sweet cherry, English holly, and tree of heaven. The list we've been using, based on the Portland plant list, has maybe a dozen more. So it's not like tremendous, but you know, a factor of three or 4 times more. So, I mean, so generally, yes, I think we're wanting to move to be more in line with the tree code, but there are some things that I think
We don't wanna lose
hang on
that are
to.
in the natural resources code, because the natural resources is a little bit different than just than what's happening on residential property.
And I just don't know if I completely agree with that. Like I'm, you know, looking through the package and, you know, there's kind of a component where there's one in the comparison, looking at the table. You know, and I think it's noted, tree code, canopy is paramount, 40% goal. Natural resources code, canopy is not a direct factor, it comes into play for WQR classification. And I guess I won't argue with how you've articulated the natural resources code. But I will say, like, remembering the discussion and the debate about tree code, like we could pull it up. Natalie was at city council talking about the water benefits, the air benefits, all these benefits that are not about 20%. I mean, yes, they were about 20% tree canopy, but they weren't exclusively. There was a lot of talk about ecosystem services and all the other functions that are provided. And so I think that like maybe the tree board is glossing over things there, because I feel like I'm just kind of mulling this over of like, why don't we just and we're probably not gonna get it done in this project, but it's like, why don't these two things just become the same thing and we figure it all out, rather than have like this little version and that little version. But that's maybe outside the scope of this project, but it just seems like generally these things are so parallel to one another, but they're both wanting to be slightly different, and it just, again, I think that's super confusing for a property owner and applicant.
Well, I mean, they are apples and pears, I think, just because of where they're coming from, what they're based on, and it's true, I wouldn't disagree with you, I'm sure those other factors were mentioned in the discussion. I think that when you look at how the rubber meets the road in the code, the tree code, at least the way I've been trying to understand it. For development, for example, development situations, it is about the canopy, like that's what's deciding how much you're paying. Whether, you know, you can take this out or that out, what even counts for canopy, they're not counting unhealthy trees or invasive trees, or when you plant a new tree, you're only getting 3/4 of it, you know, so.
Yeah.
So that's how I'm understanding, even though of course, part of the purpose of the whole tree protection thing was because of all the other, you know, benefits that they offer. And that's where I had struggled initially, and we'll talk more about it maybe in the next session about, at least for the water quality resources. The challenge of providing a clear and objective standard, like how much like great water quality is okay. Well, I think you can still probably, you can get clear and objective about it, but kind of like they did with the HCA. I mean, it's habitat, it has some larger value, but somebody at some point decided, let's call it 10%. I'm sure there was some other side by it, but said, we'll say 10% for this, for residences, we'll give them 50%. So you started trying to draw some lines somewhere, but I think that is. And that's happened with the tree code as well, right? They got some canopy targets, and that's how they're telling you how much to pay, and you know, the DBH of the trees determines how much, so.
Yeah, I guess, you know, not to belabor the point, and then I'll let Commissioner Edge step forward, is I just think like as the planning department and the planning commission, we have done so much work around streamlining. Right, in order to make things clear and objective, in order to make things easy for community members, property owners, applicants to kind of get everything figured out. And I think that, you know, and some of that, I will say, to be clear, has been us removing barriers to development, right? But I don't think that's what we're talking about, or that's not what I'm proposing here, right? I'm just proposing, like, let's come up with like a clear framework as a city. So when community member or an applicant comes to knock on the city's door. Right, it's not the forestry and planning, it's the city, like, they get one answer and it's very clear, and it's not like, oh, well, this piece of your property is mapped this way, so you gotta deal with this, and it just seems so confusing. But again, I think you understand my point, maybe this is more of a conversation to have with city council about like getting the city to act a little bit more as one city on this. I'll be done with that and hand it over to Commissioner Edge, who might completely disagree with everything I just said.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Brett. Appreciate the presentation. You know, generally, you know, I'm thinking I generally agree, you know, with what you're putting before us. The kind of the where I'm falling on this a little bit is kind of like where the state land use goals should control. You know, I mean, just kind of from, you know, I'm just thinking of this from, and not just, you know, for the focus of this body being, you know, land use, but, you know, I feel like really the state land use goals should control. And so, you know, goals 5 and 6 are, you know, what we're talking about here. The tree code is independent of that and not really focused on a state land use goal. And so I think we need to really make sure that we're allowing that to control where it's appropriate. And I think we're mostly doing that. I mean, I think there's this tendency to want to kind of pick what we see as the best pieces from both the tree code and the natural resources code and say that's what we want to do. But I think that, you know, just generally speaking, I kind of want to lean towards the natural resources code in the natural resources areas. And this may be because I inherently think of goal 5 and 6 lands as being conservation lands that allow for development, not residential lands that include a conservation portion. And so that conservation first mentality of implementing the state land use goals, that's kind of where I approach this from. And so I think that, you know, canopy is not the most important thing. You know, I don't know that the tree code should really apply in the natural resources areas. You know, I think that maybe we bring some of it over into the natural resources code, but I don't think we're talking about residential lands that where the residential tree code applies. I think we're talking about natural resources lands where residential development is allowed, or commercial development is allowed, or industrial development is allowed to a degree, and to a degree that does not constitute takings, obviously. But you know, so that's kind of where I am approaching this from, is the state land use goals control the conservation lands that allow development. We could really be thinking of them in that mindset. And yeah, it's hard for me to kind of step away from, you know, that mindset when I look at this.
Can you speak, are there a couple of specific points that are concerning you about where we're moving the wrong direction?
I mean, it's a general sense, like, you know, like I think that it's good to have a definition for tree, right? We want a clear and objective definition for what is a tree, right? You know, it shouldn't be weakened compared to what the state allows us to do in the conservation lands, just so that it can align with the tree code. You know, so if just saying if there was like, if it was like a 3-inch DBH or whatever, because it's the natural resources code and we were going to be conservation first, then have a smaller, DBH that constitutes a tree in the natural resources code. I know it makes things different, but these are different areas. They're allowed to have different definitions. I could go through this with more of that lens and kind of see, where, kind of follow up with you with an email that you could then share with, the rest of the commission if you wanted to. So it's not just, done in secrecy. But yeah, I'm just kind of, I'm not like falling on any specifics, but it's really just this general kind of deference, I feel like, to the tree code. But then we don't want to do that in the commercial and industrial areas. We only want to do it in the residential areas because residential areas is the only place where the tree code applies. That starts to make things confusing. You know what I mean? And so when, and the tree code is not enforced according to a map with a zoning overlay that you can look at on the city's website. The tree code is just about the trees and the tree canopy. So it feels like, again, that confusion is reduced by telling someone you can go look at your property on the Milwaukie.gov, Oregon.gov website, pull out and see what your overlay is with the natural resources areas, and see that, I have to comply with the natural resources code. That feels straightforward to me, versus is it, I don't know. I mean, it's that's just kind of, again, how it kind of lands with me. So I won't take up everybody's time, just kind of waxing poetic about this, but I'll follow through with, looking this over and, replying back to some of these, with more specific comments about what feels wrong and how we might approach it differently. And then, you can kind of take that and run with it from there. But yeah, that's just how it kind of settles with me, and in this general discussion of the back and forth with the, the internal discussion, with the urban forester, I feel like we want to make sure that the state land use holds control, where DLCD expects it to, I guess, might be. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. Now, the other question I had is that, graphic that you had in your presentation that showed the different boundaries on those lots, was that a real picture from the wild that you captured?
That is a real lot, I think on Fernberg, that includes wetland. I think it includes mismapped or poorly mapped wetland, because I think we understand the wetland to be more kind of tighter and on one of the lots. I'm not sure why it's spilling over onto the larger lot. I think we were going to talk about that some in the mapping work session. But yes, that's a real lot in Milwaukie that has those different overlays on it. That I think is a good
stellar example of all of the different regulatory boundaries and interplay here, and how it can be adjusted by a partition or a land division, and kind of you end up with that really tight to the boundary, or tight to the lot line boundary and all of that. It's a great example. I don't know how that exists in reality, but it's perfect.
Okay, good note. Yeah, we'll bring that one back.
And Commissioner Edge, I think if you'd be so kind, or Brett, if you'd be so kind as to share Commissioner Edge's correspondence on the topic, I think it would be helpful. Commissioner Edge, I appreciate your thoughts. I think hearing you kind of talk through that, I think personally some agreement as well of like, let's look at these parcels through the natural resources lens first and foremost, and figure out how that kind of controls, and then maybe from there think about tree code applications or anything like that. I think that as often is the case, Commissioner Edge, I appreciate your opinion.
Yeah, to be fair, I think I appreciate the lens, and so I'll look forward to seeing Commissioner Edge what other notes you have on that. Because I do think that our approach has been actually to start with a defensive position of the natural resource code and more look for opportunities to streamline because it's already happening. I think
Yeah.
the DDH example of the tree thing, I can just try to be clear, I think, in future presentations about that. I mean, I think it may be an opportunity to revisit the question of what is meaningful to capture as a tree for natural resources. I'm not sure how in depth we went into that back in 2011 when we were pulling the HCA rules in and kind of maybe touching our definition of tree then. Like I said, it used to be 6 inches or, less than 6 inches, we didn't consider it a tree. I mean, that was in the natural resources code. So if this is the time to think about whether for natural resource areas, we want to go smaller than that, I take your point that it might be fine for us to do that, even though it's not going to match quite as well. We may end up, if we use the tree permit process for everything else that matched, but we, for example, dropped our DBH to 3, let's say, then there might be some residential natural resource tree permits that or review that we would be doing and sometimes not, but some of that might become a paperwork issue. But yeah, and I will say, I think the natural resource management plan, for example, I think that's one where we weren't proposing to really change the code. I mean, we're still gonna allow Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, if they approve someone's plan, we're gonna do that with type 1 review. It's actually the tree code folks are wanting to make it more complicated to have their own review, and that's where I kind of feel like, I don't know if the lighthouse part of it shifts a little bit because they start to feel like, well, we have this mandate to kind of try to keep canopy intact, and just because you don't like this as a non-native species, I don't want you removing it, at least without a fight, or something like that. So it may just come down to there may be some times where there really just are a little bit, there's some tension or a little conflict in what the aim of each thing is.
And maybe a discussion for our urban forestry and tree board colleagues. A good friend of mine is on tree board, is also just like the use case that we're talking about is in some ways so specific relative to kind of the broad tree board, kind of aims for the city. So, I think, I don't know.
So I'd be really curious. I've been talking about this for years, it feels like. I would love to know what percentage so when we say the goal for the city is 40% tree canopy coverage, what percentage of that comes from residential lands? What percentage of that comes from parklands and open space? What percentage of that comes from our natural resources land? What percentage of that comes from commercial and industrial land? Because it makes a difference, when with how much acreage we have in each type of land use and how much their development intensity kind of needs to be to support that use, what tree canopy coverage they can, contribute. And then also, what, again, with the natural resources areas, what percentage of the city's overall 40% tree canopy coverage goal is represented by the natural resources areas that are mapped. And because if it's a really low percentage, then what are they fighting over? You know what I mean? It's like, it seems like, let us have a natural resources area that's not bothered by the urban forest, or if we're only talking about, like 10% of your total tree canopy coverage for the whole city, you know what I mean? So that whole back and forth feels weird to me, and I would really like to see the state land use goals control, in those areas. But I would love to see some data around what our expectations are in terms of who's contributing to that 40% canopy when we get there. And then that way we would have an objective measure to say, okay, well, the corridor along Johnson Creek or the corridor along Kellogg Creek and Minthorn, represents X percentage of our total tree canopy goal that we're expecting to have. And so there's a strong case or a weak case for allowing, of really strongly controlling the canopy that area is providing versus just looking at the overall habitat value of what is there. And, you know what I mean? Because again, it's like you were saying, it's that tension between, we really want tree canopy, so we would even allow invasive species to stay because, hey, it's canopy coverage and that's our checkbox that we have to make. That's not a natural resources zone goal, and it's not compatible. And so, we just, We need to be really, we need to protect what little we have that is actually native habitat.
I think those are all really good points. I also think, that there is just, and I do agree with the idea of having the natural resources obviously dictate what goes on, but at the same time, knowing that conservation is in those areas is really important. Also, just trying to understand it from a property owner's perspective, that there is the tree code and there is this whole other process, and just trying, I think the whole goal is to recognize both things and not try to streamline it for folks. Make it even so that we're all comfortable with it, that we're reaching our conservation goals at the same time where the tree canopy goals are being met. I don't think that we're trying to be in conflict, but we're trying to make a process that people can understand and navigate through the city. So I think that the percentage of the natural resource area, HCA and WQR, is tiny compared to the amount of residential lands that we have. I mean, it's tiny.
Brett, maybe you can pull the map back up.
You
I
look
mean,
at it,
I'm
right?
looking at it right now, I think to Commissioner Edge's point of like, what is it that what is the fight over? I mean, it's just like, if you were to actually, do some GIS and figure out how many parcels
Yeah,
are you talking about here, I would guess it's probably 2% of the parcels in the city that we're
and I would
we're
want
kind
to
of talking about, and I think to Commissioner Edge's point, which I support, we should be setting a higher bar, and that higher bar should be focused on WQR and HCA kind of goals over other tree board goals, so.
well, just be clear, I don't think there's a fight. Let's speak up those terms, right?
Sure,
I think
well, but
there's just an
it's-
interesting conversation.
Yeah, there's a tension,
tension.
yeah.
And that's fair enough, but let's just kind of go into it, understand that they're coming at it from one way and we're coming at it from another, but I don't think that the way that they're coming at it is
I don't
detrimental
think so
to
either, right?
what we're
I
doing.
think there's probably more alignment than
I
not,
think
right?
there's more
Like
alignment
if they're,
than not.
yeah.
It's just, I mean, it's true that and we are we're not totally what ifing, we're kind of what ifing, because that's what you do when you're trying to figure out like how to make the machine work. Like you're trying to think about, well, what about this situation, what about that situation? And so it's interesting to hear an example of if you try to remove that chestnut from Elk Rock Island in your natural restoration effort, I'm gonna block it as an urban forester because I think that's a significant tree.
But isn't that, I mean, something like that specifically, like, I guess I don't think we've moved forward with historic tree inventory or designating anything, so maybe that protection doesn't actually exist. Anyways, that's a little bit of an aside.
I mean, another what if would be with respect to the invasive tree thing, which I think gets a little bit of what Commissioner Edge is talking about. Like, so if my goal is to get invasives out of natural resource areas, and if the urban forestry team is gonna say, I hear you, but and even though I have a type 1 tree permit option for invasive tree, whatever it is about this tree in this location, I feel like it's a significant canopy contributor, I'm gonna not let you get a type 1 permit, I'm gonna bump it to type 2, because that's what happens, I guess, if it seems like I'm not gonna prove it as an urban forester, I make you do the type 2, and then I still block it, you appeal to the city manager, I think, for a decision, but I can see like the scenario where someone says, I hear you that you're wanting to get this invasive tree out of this area, but for whatever reason, I think its canopy is so valuable that I'm not on board with that. And that's where I think you're saying like, well, this is silly, like, this is like why don't our state land use goals that are trying to protect and enhance habitat, why aren't they winning here? Especially if, again, I would imagine the part of the scenario would be, I'm planting something else, like I'm taking out the invasives because I'm planting other stuff. And so it is like, we do run off the rails, I guess, in terms of speculation,
Yeah, because it's a lot of speculation because we don't have that much of this going on, period, anyway. We're talking like twice a year, maybe something comes up. So it's not that often.
yeah. But to the point of like at least trying to see if the machine is set up right to work so that we don't have to have more conversations later about, we can only think about that kind of thing, or here we are. Or at least having an internal conversation, are we all clear about the goals here, that you guys are gonna back off a little bit if we're talking about clearly invasive, even though they're not, you're for invasives, they're one of the other
The other
dozen.
8 on
Yeah.
the list, yeah.
Right.
I guess, do any other commissioners, I feel like I've taken a lot of airspace on this, just do any other
I have
commissioners?
one last
Yeah,
thing to
please.
throw into Brett's ear before I stop talking. Based on that map and kind of seeing how few parcels are probably touched really by HDA, WQRA, overlays. Just as a to see what the response is in your internal discussions. What if you propose that if there's natural resources zone on a parcel, that's the review, not a tree board review, just the natural resources review. If there's no natural resources zone on a site, tree code controls.
Yeah.
Just make it clean.
Make it very clean for an applicant or property owner, right? Like,
That's
'cause then-
exactly what I'm going for. is
Exactly,
like,
because as I think as you're thinking, Commissioner Edge, like at that point, somebody comes in with an application. You run their address and you say, natural resources mapped, yes, this route, not mapped, that route, super clean.
Potentially, yeah.
It's worth asking. I mean, I feel like I know what the initial answer would be, that there would be a fearful response about canopy. I mean, an appropriately fearful protective response about canopy. Say, wow, I'm not sure I want to give that up. And I think part of the conversation to have would be like, well, where's the trust or where's the understanding or the acceptance of a different goal that certainly isn't wanting to remove all the canopy from an area, that probably what's coming along with it is additional
Well,
planting.
we had a larger conversation about how the natural resources overlays would need to change to get to the same goals while also still having the natural resource goal, right? Like you can have canopy as part of the goals. They don't have to necessarily be in conflict, right? Like, does that make sense?
I think to be clear as well, like, I've got 19.400 pulled up and, looking at natural resources, talking about the intent, right? Protect and improve functions and values that contribute to water quality and fish and wildlife habitat and urban stream sites, including but not limited to microclimate and shade. We are literally talking about canopy there, right? So it's like, again, I don't think these things are in conflict. It probably just gets to the question of like, does the application move from like this mailbox to that mailbox or this mailbox to the other mailbox,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, in a way.
I think that's a good way to frame it. And part of why we're doing this session first is because the urban forestry team is working on changes to the tree code. So this is timely. And it's worth another approach, I think, because I was approaching more from what I felt like we were in charge of, which was 19.402, and trying to influence the tree code. I could see like trying to come at it a little bit more from the other side, like trying to push certain things, like because I think it is a little bit of an interesting proposal to say, will you relax and just give up the natural resource areas from 16.32042? Are you okay with that? It's such a small area. We've got similar goals. You'll have less to do. We're gonna probably get, I was approaching the analysis a little bit more from our side, like, where are these the same? Where are they?
It also just gets a little bit tricky because now from a staffing perspective, our urban forester goes out and then there's a whole process for the tree removal. And we don't have that. I am the default.
Sure.
I am the default, like if there's emergency trees, I'm the one who's supposed to decide that. What do I know about emergency trees? Right, so I'm trying to be sure that we have the expertise that is managing it and not the planning department.
Yeah.
We have actual urban foresters looking at things, so
Yeah.
that's another thing that we're just trying to figure out.
Yeah, can I say, on the question of the tension between canopy and natural resource conservation, I suppose, I think it's also worth thinking about why that canopy goal is in place. And are there ways that we can see those same benefits from other types of natural resource conservation, right? And also, is canopy the same if it's in a tract of land where they're trying to do some sort of conservation? The canopy there has a lot different impact on the environment around it than it does if it's in the middle of the parking lot because we're trying to avoid, urban heat island effects or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like maybe that gets a little bit lost in this thinking about canopy as just a metric. And I understand we have a goal to meet, and that's what we're working toward, but I also think there's maybe a little more nuance there with like, are we really losing that much if we lose canopy in one area where we're also doing restoration and we're also improving the natural landscape that's gonna probably provide comparable benefits to what tree canopy in that situation might. And I don't know that that leads to like a specific outcome, but I just think that's kind of one way that I'm kind of thinking through it as we talk about that tension.
So you're talking about a little bit like trying to make the case to the tree code, I guess, that you should relax a little bit and accept that percentage of canopy is not everything,
Exactly.
but there is a qualitative
Right.
aspect.
Right, we use canopy as a goal for specific things and for a reason, but canopy itself, in my mind at least, and maybe I'm totally wrong with this. Yeah, it's a proxy, it's not, the goal isn't necessarily like canopy, it's what that canopy provides, and there might be other ways of getting those same benefits. And I'm not enough of an expert on that space to understand that, but it seems to me like we don't wanna get too lost in this idea of just the metric of canopy and meeting that and how do we, stay laser focused on achieving.
I like that a lot, Commissioner Mulhorn. I think also just, potentially another useful piece of the conversation internally, like just pulled up the GIS map of the city. And looking at zoning and the habitat conservation area, and you look alongside, Kellogg Creek or other things like that, and you know what delineates the trees from everything? It's the mapped habitat conservation area that's done that. And so again, I think just like from a mutual goals kind of perspective, you see exactly where trees start and end and development starts and end based on the line on the map. And so, that might be another thing that helps our forestry, people like ourselves who also care about forestry to maybe get a little bit more comfortable with this. It's already a fairly strong and looks like successful kind of protection.
Yeah. Okay, all right, I'll take the encouragement, we'll take the charge. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts from anyone for now? I think our aim is to come back in about a month, May 9th? May 11th? April 20, where?
No.
May 14th,
May 14th.
May 14th, we're hoping to come back with kind of a code, looking at more of the code and some of the, especially like trying to figure out the clear and objective standards for water quality resource disturbance, which is one of the charges that we have in the new state law stuff, so.
Yeah, so we'll bring it in chunks, but like, we're not gonna circle back on the tree stuff next time, we're gonna talk about this other
The
topic,
next
and then we're
phase.
gonna
Okay.
keep building
Great.
on it all and then bring it back. That's the-
Thank you, cute for that.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah, thanks for being kind of clear on process. Anything else on this before we get ready to close out?
I look forward to a very rich and lengthy work session on the mapping corrections.
Oh, boy, yeah. Okay.
Great. Well, maybe, let's close out the work session, and we can move on to any planning department or planning commission updates. Do we have anything from planning commissioners to discuss? Yes, Commissioner Edge.
Thanks again, Chair. The Transportation System Plan Advisory Committee meeting was canceled for this month, so we'll be meeting next month. As always, I'm your representative on that committee, so feel free to share any thoughts or ideas with me that you'd like me to share in that venue. The other thing that's on topic with that is that today, this afternoon, at McLaughlin and Southeast 22nd Avenue, which is next to the light at River Road, there was a collision between a car and a pedestrian that left the pedestrian dead. And so I just wanted to share that with everybody that unfortunately, our streets are still taking the lives of our residents, and the transportation system plan is a really key opportunity for us to make sure that we're designing and building a transportation system that protects everybody that uses it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Commissioner Edge. I appreciate you bringing up the transportation system plan as well as the fatal crash that happened. I was planning on bringing up both those topics myself as well. You know, and I think that, you know, while we'll wait for police response to occur to kind of figure out what happened for that crash. You know, one of the things that kind of immediately came to my mind that I guess I'm hoping you can carry through in the TSP conversations is, I was kind of I've thought about it on and off, but was reminded about it immediately today of you know, 99 McLaughlin 99E is a state highway, 224 also state highway. And I was thinking about recently going, you know, kind of west of town to visit some family. And I think it's going through Tigard or Tualatin, where 99W kind of goes through those jurisdictions, and was reminded of the red light cameras and speed cameras that are installed on those corridors. And, you know, I think there's a number of Milwaukeeans that are concerned about traffic safety in our city. And I think that, you know, probably some of the big offenders in terms of speed probably aren't people that live here. They're probably people passing through our city on their way home or to work or things like that. And so I guess I would maybe just ask if you have opportunities with others through the transportation system plan to think maybe about some of those tools that we could put in our toolbox in terms of, you know, speed cameras or red light cameras on 224 or McLaughlin. You know, I just feel like it would help slow traffic a lot more. I've seen that effect in those other cities, even when I drive through them, how much I slow down and pay attention. And, you know, Milwaukee Police Department does a lot of great work, but we also have a small team, can't be everywhere at once. And I think if we were to look at some automated enforcement options like that, you know, we might be able to prevent other future kinds of accidents or crashes. So thanks for kind of bringing that up. And I don't know if anyone else has anything they wanted to kind of weigh in on this.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I didn't talk about it here, but because it was really focused on the McLaughlin between the southern border of Milwaukee and the Clackamas River. But I was on a committee last year that for ODOT, and they had a project where they were looking at McLaughlin Boulevard and what can they do there to make it a more humane facility ultimately. And one of the things that came out of that was the proposal for extending the median strip design from downtown Milwaukee through out to the Park Avenue Max station, and reducing the speed limit to go along with that. And that would be really beneficial for the city, in addition to the unincorporated community immediately south of the city along McLaughlin Boulevard. And I mean, maybe that's an opportunity for the city to advocate for, you know, ODOT to pick up a grant, you know, to do something like that. You know, I don't know, you know, but ODOT doesn't typically just do things of their own accord. They tend to need to be prompted. And just for what it's worth, the community immediately south of you has very little agency on their own. You know, there's nothing that quite compares to having a city and, you know, to have a voice, you know, for a community. And right now that community doesn't have that. And so, you know, there's, with the fact that this could benefit, you know, city residents at the southern end, you know, along McLaughlin Boulevard, you know, to the east of Island Station. I mean, maybe this is something the city, you know, could advocate for ODOT to do. You know, just a thought since you brought that up.
Of the TSP.
I was gonna say that also, I know the city owns a property down there that they are hoping to develop in the future for affordable housing. And it's right there next to the station, and it will be a great addition to actually reduce the speed on that area and have a better connection with the city itself. And make it actually a affordable space for everybody, like really integrated within the city, not like a segregated space. So I think that would be a great plan to kind of integrate that space to that.
Yeah, I know that you know, a challenge there, I think, from a kind of a traffic design perspective is also just the topography change coming, especially if you're driving McLaughlin north to south and you come from Park down the hill into Milwaukie, and I just know that, you know, I've seen it, I think myself, both as a driver and as a pedestrian, how vehicles can just really catch a lot of speed kind of going down that hill. And at least myself, I mean, I always try and be cautious, but you also never know if Milwaukie PD is hiding behind the railroad bridge, as often has been the case. But I think, again, I've just thought, you know, if there was an opportunity to put speed cameras up or light cameras in some of those locations, you'll probably just have a more universal effect. And so I think, you know, thinking about medians, thinking about those other solutions, you know, let's have conversations about those tools as we move through the TSP, and especially how those tools can, I think, as Commissioner Fuenmayor was suggesting, they can like make development more hospitable at the same time too, so. Yeah. Well, any other planning department or planning commission updates? Thanks again, Commissioner Edge, for kind of bringing that up. Super unfortunate to have that happening on Milwaukee streets. Can we talk about our forecast for future meetings?
Yeah, so the next meeting that we'll have will be on May 14th, and like I said earlier, we're gonna talk about the CIAC, and then I'll also bring the draft goals and policies for the TSB to you all. We had our community workshop last month, and we've had the survey open. It's open until the 17th, and so we will be incorporating the comments that we've heard from that feedback into the goals and policies. So I will bring those to you all.
All right, well, if there's nothing else, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll motion to adjourn.
Been moved,
I'll second.
been seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Right.
Have a good night, everyone, thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Good to see you.
Right.